Good morning, and welcome to the second year of the Roger Casement Summer School. I should point out the emergency exits behind you there as you came in, and over here as well. And could I ask you to please switch off the mobile phones? Now, it gives me great honour to introduce our chair, Nollaig Mac Congail. She's a good old friend of mine. Not that old, though.
Thank you.
Donald.
We're getting me fáilte. Would you prefer if I stood there? Doesn't matter. We keep it casual? Keep it casual. Gur míle maithagaí. Stocha gin chéadro the cheart marrána go bhean áitiúil is onar mór an hurtar ceisteirt aonrud ó íana the cheantar hain. As I said, I'm a local woman, but I'm a blow-in. So it's always nice when you're asked to do anything in your own area, because your hardest audience, your greatest critique are the people in your own community, they say. So I don't know if that's good or bad. Is onar mór am event seanniu, agus is stocha go ben rud is simúla faoi Roger Casement ná a couple of blianoch in Rumstig a man I never knew much about Roger Casement. I knew of him, of course, but a few years ago when I was doing a master's in gender and women's studies, we were doing a module on conflict and violence against women in turbulent countries, to say the least. So I read more about Roger Casement, and I have to say it was a huge sort of moment of pride for me when I realised on Obair Chrua agus the incredible work or the incredible attention he had brought to the issue of human rights issues. And, you know, tá ceangal mór idir carta daine agus ahantas agus tanga. There's a huge connection between human rights. I mean, human rights covers, of course, education, it covers health, it covers food, but it also covers identity. Agus mar chuide gon ahantas atá ag duine, as part of one's identity, we have our language. Agus dúine mar bhinloch sa tír, us who are a minority in Ireland, Irish speakers, we are loud, we have to roar because we're a small bunch of people. Ach, ní an vinnic, not very often are we recognised that it is a basic right that we have is to, as much as we can, as much as the state participate with us, that we can do as much as we can and conduct our lives as Gaeilge. An chéad teanga atá ain, agus síon bhéaril an dorna teanga. I use that as an excuse a lot, though. I always say if I don't understand what's going on, I say, English is my second language, sorry. Agus is leisceil maithe, it works, believe it or not. Tusamúid, mar ní hen saniolaí mise, agus tá masú leis a lá, tá masú le rud cinnta ólam faoi Roger Casement. I'm looking forward to learn more about Roger Casement. I'm looking forward to the language perspective of the man. And I suppose we're coming from two different perspectives an seo. Ach, ceapan go mbeadh sé haon bródú leis na caintúirí taine inniu. So mar sin cuiremuid tús leis. Dosach báire Nollaig Mac Congail, tá Nollaig a le caintlinn ar dús fi Roger Casement agus an na dhé cuiremuid ceistnaí. So we have an opportunity to get to ask questions afterwards. Toig muid brise breg, we'll take a little break agus an sin be cíar an na caintlinn a spell first. Agus dearcha eile tuiscins tá aine an teanga sa deisceart achas cínte, I would say, as Gael Scullina have been revolutionary with the language, West Belfast and Belfast activists are going to be hugely influential in the future of the language, even more so than Southern native speakers, I think, but we'll hear more about that later on. So, mar sin chuigi bhfuil lábhar le chéad chuigi fáilte roimh Nollaig.
All right, Michael Flanage. I think you're all to be commended for sacrificing a beautiful day in a scenic location. I hope at the end of an hour's talk or so that you won't be saying I should have gone for the other option. Now, anybody who knows anything, anybody who's interested in Irish history has spoiled for choice. right? When you remember that literacy was introduced in this country 1,500 years ago, we have so many records here, and so much has happened internally and externally from the point of view of the Irish nation. That's a real smorgasbord. Ireland is on the periphery of the European continent. Now, bear that in mind in a historical perspective. Going far back, you had the maritime superhighway stretching from North Africa, right? Iberian Peninsula, up past Scotland, the Nordic countries, etc. Also, it was the last stop on the way to America, and also the gateway to other places like Canada, South America, Australia, and whatever you're having yourself. So we've left our imprint all over the world. And I suppose in the contemporary situation, we'll have to put Dubai into the mix as well, because we have a certain cohort out there. So Ireland is not important from the point of view of its natural resources. Ireland is important from the point of view of the people who lived here and the contribution they have made in all areas of life, be it in human toil and working, be it in the religious area, political area, or whatever. Everywhere they went, they left their mark. So, anybody interested in Irish history, as I said, they're spoiled for choice. If one were to ask me what is my favorite period, I would say without a doubt, it's the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. Because this is the period which has impacted greatly into where we are today. But also, this is the period, this is the Renaissance period, right? The revival period of Ireland, when so many things came together. So many ideas were bandied around, were followed, and also culminating in a tsunami which resulted in the 1916 and 16 Rising. We have more documentation about that particular period. And it was a documentation in the form of the printed word which influenced so many people. This is the period that Casement belonged to. This is the period of, and the manner of communication which influenced Casement, because Casement was a most unlikely person to end up where he ended up for a cause that he espoused all his life. Now, people who are familiar with the end of the 19th century know that this was a time of mass communication, right? We're talking about social media and how strong the message of social media and the means of communication that it is. But at the end of the 19th century, the printed word was an even stronger and more forceful force than anything before. Think of a country like Ireland that was starved of literacy, right? You had get the perspective here, a small country, a small population base, okay? And remember all the deprivation that the Irish people had to, the ordinary Irish people had to suffer, right? In terms of literacy, etc. Immediately after the Great Famine, you would ask yourself, who in Ireland was able to read and write? And who commonly read and wrote? In what language did they read and write, etc.? Communication, immigration, interaction, all of these things are important. And the proliferation, the steady advance of literacy in Ireland. Now remember, in 1831, you set up the national school, right? What was the national school? But this was the first time that literacy was offered to the people of Ireland gradually, right, over the century, to all people of Ireland. It wasn't confined necessarily to the... There were drawbacks, people who couldn't go, hadn't shoes, etc., and had to walk long distances. But this was the first opportunity for mass literacy in the country, in Ireland, through the medium of the English language. It wasn't just of the privileged. But with that, you had the revolution in the print media, not only in Ireland, but all over the world, right? The print media and also the developments in the technology of printing meant that you could print more and at a cheaper rate. And when you're at a heightened amount of literacy within the country, the reach of the newspaper could go to all corners of the country. To give you an example of how important and how influential the newspaper was at the time, you take one of the most Gaelic-speaking parts of the country at the time, at the end of the 19th century, right? That would be somewhere, and it's replicated in other parts of the country as well. Somewhere like Ranafast, a bastion of Gaelic culture, okay, where most of the population were monoglot Gaelic speakers, right? It had nothing to commend itself in terms of the modern world. It had no main road, it had no chapel, it had no graveyard, it had no pub, and it didn't even have the decency to have a police barracks, right? It was beyond contempt, but they had a strong, rich storytelling and singing tradition. Now, the person most revered in that type of society, prior to the end of the 19th century, was the Shanahy, and he held court in the local houses. He had the position of importance, sitting there and the audience around him in the kitchen as he recited a story or poetry or whatever it was. Right? By the end of the 19th century, that person's place was usurped by the person who was able to read an English language newspaper and regale the audience with what was happening, not only in their own country, but perhaps anything relating to Ireland, particularly in this case, in the Boer War. Right? The people of Ranafast in 1899 or whatever were more familiar with the generals in the Boer War than they were with some of the members of parliament in their own country. They knew the names of everybody, they knew all of the battles, they knew the landscape of South Africa. Right? This was the power, and they had a rapt, enthralled audience listening to all of this. The greatest educational force in the end of the 19th century was the newspaper. Because remember, it was not the educational system, which was anything to do, had nothing to do with the education of the Irish people along traditional and native lines. And of course, anybody and not only did you have the newspapers, but you have to examine the content of those newspapers. There was a proliferation with the passage of time in terms of newspapers and magazines of nationalist material. And again, if you look at the list and see how the numbers increased, what was the contents of these magazines and the newspapers? And a lot of them carried a lot of serials about patriotic matters, etc. You had a body of literature coming which was based on Irish history and fiction. You had in some of the newspapers, for instance, Douglas Hyde's Love Songs of Connacht. You had O'Growney's Simple Lessons in Irish. These were all serialized in English language newspapers in Ireland. And remember also that there were the newspapers dealing with Irish matters and catering for Irish audiences. They were being produced in various cities in the States and also Canada, South America, and in Australia. To give you some examples, one particular magazine which came from the north of Ireland was called the Shan Van Watt, right? And this was produced by Alice Milligan, and you'll hear more about her this afternoon, and also by Anna Johnson, right? Now, this was a cultural, political magazine which lasted several years. And the reach of that, you would say, from Belfast, the reach of that was out as far as Montana, because there was a letter written in one of the issues saying, congratulations on your magazine, etc. And also my thanks to my fellow miner who threw a copy of the magazine down the mine shaft to me. Right? Another instance where you had someone you've heard of, I'm sure, of Patrick McGill, the Navy poet, okay, and all his realism and what the Tatty Hogers and everything else. But he started his literary career, as so many did, in the nationalist newspaper, right? And he started off, as far as I remember, in the Strabane Chronicle. And the first two bits of prose that he published were folk tales. In the body of one of the folk tales, it said, they were recounting the story or whatever, and in brackets, parentheses, he said, you know, I read this in the paper sent by my cousin from Philadelphia. Right? So people were getting, and this was true of Connemara as well, they were getting information about their own country, about their own culture, through various different sources and as far as field, as over in America, which were sent back home, even songs that emigrated with the people, were lost at home, were printed over in the States, brought back home, and incorporated again and got a new lease of life. So there was so much information contained in the printed word in various fora at the end of the 19th century. Now, Roger Casement, being an intelligent person, being a well-read person, being a well-traveled person, right? He would be au fait with all of this, especially when you're away from home, right? That you're educated in a different realm. Such an education would have been transmitted to him, would not have been transmitted, namely an education about his own country, about his identity, heritage, etc. This was not communicated to him, as you would expect through an education system, because, as we know, the educational system at the time made no reference to the Irish language, culture, heritage, or whatever. And Casement himself was to admit this. He said, I was taught nothing about Ireland in Ballymena School. I don't think the word was ever mentioned in a single class of the school. And all I know of my country, I learned outside of the school. And this was true of that whole generation. And remember what Douglas Hyde said, the raison d'etre of the primary school system in Ireland was to make little Johnny Bulls out of the children of Ireland. So the question of the whole question of newspapers and magazines as educational and influencing tools is of the utmost importance and requires a lot more scrutiny. Apart altogether from what was appearing, you see, in the newspapers, etc., there was an explosion of cultural, national printed matter. And this was, as I said, in no way facilitated by all the revolution, technology, etc., in the printing press. Now, one newspaper in particular, I suspect, did have a great influence over Casement in his formative years and on countless others in informing him about Ireland, namely the newspaper, the Freeman's Journal, and the Weekly Freeman, right? Now, sometimes the Freeman's Journal and the Weekly Freedom get a bad press. Opinions are divided about it. For instance, James Joyce referred to the Freeman's Journal and the Weekly Freeman as the Daily Arsewiper and the Weekly Urinal. But who would heed Joyce? But the Freeman's Journal, or the Weekly Freeman, was a great supporter of the Irish language and did an awful lot to instill nationalist feelings and promote cultural and introduce the Irish language and Irish literature, etc., to the readership. Remember that the Freeman was the most popular and most read newspaper in the whole of the national newspaper in the whole of the country at the end of the 19th century. And remember what Casement himself said. In his school days, he begged from the aunt with whom he spent his holidays for possession of an attic room, which he turned into a little study. And the writer remembers the walls papered with cartoons cut out of the Weekly Freeman, showing the various nationalists who had suffered imprisonment at Irish hands for the sake of their belief in Ireland as a nation. Right? Now remember, as a young man in his bedroom up in the attic, looking at all of these cartoons, seeing, cartoon depictions of the famine in Ireland and the Queen at the time, okay, and also Ireland starving and Ireland being beaten, etc. They had an influence on the mind of the person. And remember also in the case of Eamon de Valera, it was said during his youth that the walls, namely the walls of his bedroom, the walls of his loft were covered with political cartoons from the Weekly Freeman. Right? The Weekly Freeman, as I said, was one of the most influencing national agents at the time. And also, as we know, the Weekly Freeman bankrolled a lot of the prizes for the Earthists, etc. And they published, as I said, Seriatim, a lot of Hyde's work, and also O'Groundy's simple lessons. And also, a fact not well known, it was one of the most one of the columns within the Weekly Freeman was the most influential in putting people in the direction of the Gaelic League later on when it was founded in 1893. The column then, right, which appeared regularly for years, was the Irish Fireside Club. It was a column run by Rose Kavanagh for children. And they had a list of things that they wanted to. It was a club, and you signed up for the club, and you recruited members, and then you went up the ranks at different stages. You became corporal, lieutenant, and everything else. Most influential people in the Gaelic League and in the early Irish New State were members of that particular club. That is what they got where they got their education about being patriotic and true to the heritage and identity of Ireland, mostly through the medium of the English language, but they were also taught to learn, or encouraged to learn and respect, and in time to contribute through the medium of the Irish language. Now, you know, we always ask the question, when does a person begin to follow a particular course in life? One of the great enigmas of modern Irish society is when, where, how, and why did Eamon de Valera become a patriot or a nationalist or whatever? At what point in his career did he start getting an interest in Ireland, its heritage, etc.? And you find out that Eamon de Valera was a secretary of the branch of the Irish Fireside Club in Bruff in his own time. Other people who rose high in the ranks of the Gaelic League, right? Like Tomás Ó Concannon, Mulrennan, Stephen Barrett, all of these people, Arthur Griffith, William Rooney, Seamus Clandillan, and writers like Sean Bon McMenamin, Andreas O'Bweel, Owen O'Sharkey, Thomas Barrett, etc. All of these people were introduced to, but they weren't introduced through the educational system. They got their first, and Agnes Farley, of course, a lot of their education or inspiration or direction towards Irish patriotism through the Irish Side Club. So people at the time would have got their instruction, their influence from these particular. Now, so newspapers, the printed media, books, etc., all contributed to the education of the likes of Roger Casement. But in addition to that, Casement was to connect and to interact closely with the whole coterie of Gaelic revivalists in the northeast of Ireland. People, many of them of a similar background to himself. And we mention in particular people like Bigger, people like Ada McNeil, Margaret Dobbs, Rose Young, Alice Milligan, Mary Hutton, etc. Names that are synonymous with all that was most proactive and enthusiastic in the Gaelic cause and the Irish Gaelic movement. Now, having said all that, the first time we encounter Casement publicly in terms of the Gaelic arena would be in 1904 when he made his presence felt, and that was recorded publicly in that arena. From then on, he is central and an important contributor to the whole of the movement, not only ideologically, practically, and in terms of generating publicity, because remember, he was a great coup for the Conradh na Gaeilge, a person of his background, a person of his status within the British regime, that he should be aligned so publicly with the cause of the movement. But also he was heavily involved in bankrolling actual Gaelic-related causes. As for his actual knowledge of the Gaelic language, very little is known for certain. It is stated, for instance, that Robert Lind, a friend of his, a Gaelic activist and teacher of Irish in the Gaelic League in London, he taught Roger Casement Irish in the years 1902 or 3. But prior to that, Casement was involved, had a prolonged séjour in the Gaeltacht and Donegal. And this was probably, from other evidence we have, it was in the year 1889. It said in an article in the Donegal Annual in 1966, Casement too was a lover of the Irish language, which brought him more than once to Donegal, the nearest large Gaeltacht to his Antrim home. A member of our society, Mr. Cecil King, when staff reporter some years ago with the Derry Journal, took down the following story from a master Boyle who taught at Schlandran near Buncrana in Inishowen. When Roger Casement resolved to go to the Gaeltacht to learn Irish, the place he selected was Urris in Inishowen. He walked the whole way from Ballymoney in County Antrim to Lishalle, crossed the ferry to Culmore, proceeded over the Scalp, along the old road to Buncrana, and thence through the Gap of Mamore to Urris. Here he spent 6 months, living the life of the people, hearing and speaking nothing but Irish, and leaving for his home in Antrim with a good working knowledge of the vernacular. He is said to have lodged in a townland of Tir na Sligo. He usually wore a welly coat, a sleeved waistcoat, made of homespun. In those 6 months, he learned to love the place and the people, laying the foundations of an affection that he retained to the last. Now, Seamus O'Cleary quotes from a letter written by Casement on the 5th of March 1904 on his history of the interaction, the formal interaction with the Gaelic movement. He said, "I had not much acquaintance with the Gaelic movement in Ireland until last month, when I was fortunate enough to come across at 2 country houses, one in Cork and one in Antrim, I was visiting, ladies in touch with the movement. And from them, I learned how deep was the interest growing in this effort to keep alive and extend Irish influences and thought. The 2 ladies in question were the Honourable Louisa Farquharson and Ada McNeill. Casement met Louisa in February 1904 in Ballyhooly, County Cork, a member and later chief of the Gaelic Society of London. And remember, the Gaelic Society, the Gaelic movement, was not confined to Ireland alone, but you had the Literary Society over in London as well, the Gaelic League as well, and you also had the Gaelic movement in Scotland, and you had the Welsh movement in Wales, and you also had the movement, as I said, in other countries. Now these women, as so many women did in his life, had great influence over Roger Casement, and he maintained contact with them ever afterwards. Now, whatever about his history of the knowledge of the Irish language or his expertise therein, we see from that year 1904 on, here is a man who is completely committed to the Irish language and to all that is happening to promote that particular language. And he resembles in this respect, as so many of the revivalists did at the time, it reminds you of someone, in religious terms, who is a born-again Christian, right? They have the enthusiasm, right, for the language and everything goes and all to promote. Not only that, but they become so wrapped up that they start spouting poetry, right? They find themselves in the tradition of the old bards, praising the poems, like Casement himself. In the Irish language, the poem, "It is gone from the hill and the glen, the strong speech of our sires. It is sunk in the mire and the fen of our nameless desires. We have bartered the speech of the Gael for a tongue that would pay, and we stand with the lips of us pale and bloodless today. We have bartered the birthright of men that our sons would be liars. It is gone from the hill and the glen, the strong speech of the sire. I don't know what it was that they were drinking at the time, but they all thought they were great poets. They all thought they were great songsters, great dancers, and everything else. You didn't commit half-heartedly to the Gaelic movement. You were in there for the long haul and did everything. So Casement's first public association with the Gaelic League was at Féis na Glan in County Antrim, and that was held in the summer of 1904. And here we witness a public record of his active participation in the promotion of all of the ideals and activities of the League, and his association with the main promoters and enthusiasts for the movement, initially in the northeast of Ireland. The Féis was looked upon. It was a great promotion tool for the Gaelic movement, an excellent promotion tool and propagandist tool, held at local and provincial and then at national level with the Oireachtas. On the committee of Féis na Glan, Case was more than actively involved in its execution and success. And his involvement with the Gaelic movement increases locally and nationally from that time, 1904. And again, if you read the accounts, because the Gaelic League was all about propaganda, right? You had to educate the masses. You had to be seen living that Gaelic ideal and also the Gaelic cause. Again, Ben Moore, a friend of Casey's from this time, talks about the Féis na Glan. And it gives you some insight into how people were energized by the whole Gaelic movement. Hundreds of young boys and girls were brought into contact with their motherland. The schoolroom became a center of activity. The Gaelic classes aroused a great interest in subjects that had slept for years. The quaint songs of the Gael took the place of the vulgar productions from overseas. The clash of the cannon resounded in every glen. Could be like Braveheart. And stout young hurlers were to be seen at play on many a field on the glorious summer days of a dozen years ago. The travelling teacher, in the teeth of wild tempestuous storms, cycled around the rugged coast of Antrim between Ballycastle and Glenarm, showering his Gaelic lessons around. The Gael was resurgent in those days in the glens. Seeds were dropped here and there in those days that will yet fructify. Fructify is a great word, and so much fallen into decline. And the gleaners of Gaelic Ireland will in other years, with a freshness and strength, gather the harvest. And now many figures loom up on the horizon of my mind and pass quickly in succession. Small men and big men, keen thinkers, great workers, grand intellects, men and women who shaped and fashioned a clean Gaelic policy for the children of the North. Great stuff, great propaganda, and this appearing in all newspapers, etc. And Douglas Hyde was to make the acquaintance of Casement in that year at the Féis Liggy, I think. And he said, Douglas Hyde said in one of his books, there was a man wanting to make my acquaintance, and he was described him as a far ard usal Allen, a tall man, a gentleman, and also a very good-looking person. And from that liaison, Casement became more identified with the Gaelic language, and he started bankrolling a lot of the activities of the Gaelic language. His first action was to pay, to deliver some money to the newly founded College de Gaeilge in Bealach in Cork, which opened in 1904, and he was to continue to do this and bankroll so many other of the Gaelic colleges as long as his money lasted. So he found, and a lot of the people who were involved, he got to know the people who were involved with these various colleges, and down there in Bellahangaird, he got to know as well Mrs. Stopford Green, and you'll be hearing about her later on, and Dr. Hennebrey. Right? Casement later stressed the importance of the language and the contribution that the Gaelic summer colleges were making towards that end. And again, he articulates his love and the importance of the Irish language for Irish identity, heritage, etc. Right? He said, at one point at this time, if ever we let the Irish language die, we will have parted with the foundation stone of Irish nationality. And although we may see Ireland a nation, it will be a nation lacking the mind, the culture, the colour, the very lifeblood of its forefathers. I have just come from a trip through Connemara, and I see everywhere the same evidence of loss of nationality in the decay of the language. If we let it die, we shall be a base generation of Irishmen, and those who come after us may well say it was a cowardly and selfish generation of the 20th century that allowed the language to die out. Most of these people of the ilk of Casement, Owen MacNeill, De Valera himself, they're on record as saying, right, given the choice between losing the language and losing freedom, they would prefer to lose freedom. Once the language is gone forever. You lose freedom, you'll have another bite at the cherry later on, as happened in the history of Ireland. You keep coming back and back and back, etc. The importance of the language, the key to the culture, and key to everything else, is always stressed. And of course, the fountainhead of the language is the Gaeltacht, right? They looked upon the Gaeltacht as a Mecca. This is the Holy Grail, right? The Holy Land. And take different people and what they thought of the Gaeltacht and all it embodied and all it represented. In one particular case, for instance, if I can only find the quote, it was in the case of Sean O'Fueline, the celebrated writer, because he was a Gaelic enthusiast, along with Frank O'Connor, under the direction of Daniel Corkery, right? Speaking at a later date, and he was a realist as well, hard-headed, and he talks about, in his own experience, visits to the Gaeltacht. He says, when it became popular and profitable to learn the Irish language, etc., right? And then when you went into the Gaeltacht, he said, the professional Gaels came and went. The first thing they did was to have their hair, when they were going to the Gaeltacht, they had their hair cut in a strange reversal of the ancient Irish tonsure. This is when they arrived at the Gaeltacht, civil service and the like. They then removed their collars and ties, turned up the ends of their trousers, and shook themselves happily, clearly feeling that they had returned to the land of their fathers and were free of the base trammels of English civilization. They then dived out of doors, and I saw them flying along the road like hares at a coursing match. I never in my life saw such innocent elation, unless it be that of children released from school. But I was wrong. 20 years ago, when I first discovered the Gaeltacht myself, I felt exactly the same sense of release. It was like taking off one's clothes for a swim naked in a mountain pool. Nobody who has not had this sensation of suddenly belonging somewhere, of finding the lap of a lost mother, can understand what a release the discovery of the Gaelic world meant to modern Ireland. This will give you some insight into what these people were, what motivated them, and what landed them where they ended up. So, it had a great support Casement had, because the establishment of these summer colleges in various areas. In 1904, Belhan Gaelic in Cork. 1905, you had Ulskull Narinne in Portlarig, and also in Turvicadia, College de Connacht, and also College de Cole in Belfast. 1906, you had College de Ullu in Gort the Hark, you had College in the Gidda Maestri in Letterkenny, and you had College de Lyon in Dublin here, etc., etc. Remember why they were set up: to address the inadequacies of the teaching profession vis-a-vis there. As you won the right to teach Irish and put it in the school curriculum and have Irish taught through the medium of Irish and Gaelic-speaking areas, you needed trained teachers, and they were not available, right? This was to train people in the most modern methods of language teaching, and also to educate native speakers and to make them trained teachers of Irish in the Gaelic branches, and also to introduce the general public to Irish heritage literature, etc. And they were held usually in the summer months or the autumn, etc., when Irish countryside usually is at its most appealing. So here he was, and the good thing about at the early period that they were very democratic, as was the whole of the Gaelic League movement in its constitution, namely the men and women from all denominations, all political creeds, etc., etc. And this was one of the strengths, and this is why it attracted such high-profile people from all over the country and from elsewhere in the world. This is the root idea of the whole Gaelic League, that to the Irish race, the knowledge of their own country, history, and language is the one sure foundation on which to build all other knowledge. It is the great idea underlying all educational schemes of the present day in every country. Know yourself, get in touch with your past. He was a great supporter, and his pocket felt it as well, a great supporter of all of these colleges. He bankrolled them and helped to build them and everything else. In 1904 also, Casement went to the Aran Islands. You couldn't be a Gaelic revivalist without going to the Aran Islands, because this is where all the enthusiasts, this is where all the emphasis stemmed from. You had the foreign linguists, you had Dutton, you had Kuno Mayer, you had Pedersen, you had Fink, you had the Irish revivalists, O'Hickey, O'Growney. Anybody who was anything under the banner of Irish visited. They had to worship at the shrine of the Aran Islands. It's a far removed from where it is now, where you can't get a teacher, right? And in a seer to teach STEM subjects through the medium of Irish, right? How the mighty have fallen. But this is where they ought, so he went there. And he was not impressed. Something like Synge himself, you see. Synge wasn't impressed with the level of Irish, and because of the Anglicization of this bastion of Gaelic culture, right? So what Casement said about his experience of the Aran Islands: the general mass of the Irish-speaking parents have kicked the language out of doors. In Kilronan, I heard the fathers and mothers speaking in a vile attempt at English to their children, and they with a rich, splendid speech of their own. It is a shameful and most inexplicable to a man who has travelled as I have amongst peoples who each and all respect and love their own language. My own countrymen alone are contemptible, for it lies with the people themselves, and if they wished or cared for their country, they could keep their language, her language here in the West, where it is still known and spoken, right? And this disgusted him and gave him further ammunition or further encouragement to promote the language, because the rest of the country was going to follow in the wake of this tide of Anglicization. And as a result of that, he became involved in a cause célèbre of the Gaelic League, namely in the school in Towin. Towin was a small island, it's now joined up, just outside Galway. And at the time, out of patriotic, out of Gaelic fervour, they had the people there, which was Gaelic speaking, they objected to they said that they were not being taught through the medium of English in the national school, so they boycotted the school, and with the passage of time, the teacher was let go, and the school fell into disrepair. Now, so this caused a furore because of the whole education thrust of the Gaelic League, etc. And Casement got in on the action, right? He said, "I have not anywhere seen or heard of such a brave, true spirit as beats in that handful of poverty-stricken Irishmen and women. They are Irish to the heart. And it did me more good than all else I have seen in Ireland to find them so fiercely trying in the face of the uttermost difficulty to keep their own language. They are setting a splendid example to all the rest of the country around, where although the Irish language lives on the lips of the old, it has not been given up by them to their children." Right? So he praises the stance of these people who will sacrifice everything in order to have their kids educated. And of course, he puts his hands on his pocket. It was a big to-do in the newspapers at the time, etc., and subscriptions were asked, etc., etc. And here he puts his hand in his pocket and pays most of the money to have the school repaired and everything else, and teaching to conducted through the medium of Irish. And here he made the main person involved with that was Seamus O'Byrne, and he was to come in contact him later on with his humanitarian movement to feed children in the Connemara Gaeltacht later on. So here we have Casement championing the Gaelic cause, articulating his love for the Irish language, decrying the Anglicisation of the country, supporting the underdogs' fight for the language. And as I said, so this year, 1904, was the beginning of his interaction and involvement with the Gaelic language and the Gaelic movement and the Gaeltacht itself. He was involved from then on with all of the factions, everything that the Gaelic League tried to do, every bit of territory they tried to reclaim. And from the point of view of the Gaeltacht, the Gaelic and the Gaeltacht and the people of the Gaeltacht had to be kept at home for the Gaelic to survive, and also for the Gaelic to be promoted even in the Gaelic-speaking areas. And this, particularly in Gorta Hark, this was his favourite place, and also he brought his cousin there, the Bannisters, and they became so enamoured with the place that they started composing poetry as well about it. He helped a financially rewarded teachers who engaged in the bilingual program in the schools. He also gave out prizes to students at the Gaeltacht College, etc. He also went out to Tory Island and encouraged and also gave them money. So he's linked with support for the Irish language in the Gaeltacht. And he's recorded as financially supporting various summer colleges, Gaeltacht schools in remote and isolated locations. For instance, the school in na Cruachgarma, the Blue Stack Mountains in central Donegal, right? Because teachers, then and even now do like their comforts, and you don't like to go to the most backward spots in Ireland. And so he would give extra financial inducements to teachers who would go there to such a place, or to the Rathlin Island School in Antrim, and a visitor to Tory Island. He espoused all efforts to improve the promotion, status, and prominence of the Irish language in Irish society. For instance, there were so many causes for the Gaelic League where they tried to get the status of the Irish language, a service available to the people of Irish through the medium of their own language. One perhaps would be the appointment of Gaelic-speaking doctors in Gaelic-speaking areas. And that makes sense to everybody, but it wasn't happening. So this was a big effort on behalf of the Gaelic League. And it was Pather Toner McGinley who mentioned this at one stage. He was a big figure in the Gaelic League. He says about this appointment of Gaelic-speaking doctors in Gaelic-speaking areas, the people ought to take a vigorous stand in the matter and insist that everyone who holds any intercourse with them should address them in the native tongue. They should not, as far as they can prevent it, allow any man to be appointed to a public position in the Irish-speaking districts until he can speak Irish. There's a story told of a dispensary doctor who had to visit an old lady who did not speak English. He had occasion to ask her a very usual question in some circumstances, namely, were her bowels regular? And not being able to elicit an answer in Saxon, mustered what Irish he knew and asked her, "And will the hone bug?" Don't need to translate. A rendering of the question which brought him no nearer an answer. It's a shame to have a dispensary doctor who cannot converse with their patients in their native tongue. It's a shame to have officers of the law, poor law officials, and others having intimate relations with the people who cannot speak the language of the people. It's a shame to have teachers teach little children whose language they do not understand and with whom they have no medium of communication. Yet we see all these things, and we have got so accustomed to them that we accept them as matters of course. This is what they were fighting against, trying to push back. And other things too, like the question of, the official status of your name in Irish, right? And writing it on letters and it would be delivered and putting it on your cart, etc. And some famous cases, as you know, with Neil McGill of Regis and TJ Carter made a film of that about a year ago. And registering one name, and everybody got on to it. Great propaganda, and Lady Gregory was involved in different parts. And in a letter, Casement wrote, Irishmen were being sent to jail for writing their names in Irish in Irish. In 1905, says Casement, some dozen Irishmen went to jail on that account. They got a week's imprisonment on the ground that they were breaking the law. The technical breach of law was that the name was not legible, and that one of his friends, a student of the university, got a week's imprisonment because he refused to sign his name Eamon in the anglicised form Edmund. And the English think that they love freedom, says Casement. And it's a great one because, the writing on the card was great. And it caused, got a lot of publicity, and things were rectified after that. But of course, and you had the Irish song made about it, and Trucklean Dunn. And also you had Brian O'Higgin made a comic skit poem about it called Moses, Right to Rely, Uralai, Uralai. I'll not sing it for you, you can look it up for yourself. This was also true. The causes he championed, the Gaelic League champion, to have Irish introduced as a matriculation subject for the university. Right? Well, it was in 1909. And of course, they got locked in battle with the Catholic Church then, you see. It was a very contentious debate. It stirred up a lot of passions. Casement again wrote into that. He said, if the university is not a poor man's university, it cannot live. The poor Irish student is not ashamed of his country or afraid of his language. If the university is to be built up by the Irish people, then the Irish language must be its foundation stone. Right? Other causes during the year he was involved with, all the different causes to do with that, with his wishes, all the causes, be they humanitarian, be they economic, be they military, etc. They were all interconnected with his views on the Irish language. The importance of the Irish language was paramount to everything he did. On one occasion when he was over, that they had these fairs for Irish crafts in different places, and there was one held over in London. And who brought a stall over but Pat the Cope Gallagher, remember, the founder of the co-op movement, etc. And he records in his autobiography, he was saying there, another man was frail, a person who appeared at his stall, was frail with a black beard. The lady was also delicate with silvery grey hair. They came to me. The gentleman with the black beard asked me if I was Mr. Gallagher. I said I was. Let me introduce my friends to you, he said. Mrs. Stafford Green, Lord Skerrin, the Honourable Mr. Gibson, Lord Ashburn's heir, and my own name is Roger Casement. Then he asked him more about things about Donegal, etc., and Mrs. Stafford Green taught him, etc. And when he was leaving, Sir Roger Casement gripped my hand tightly and said, I have been told that you're doing good work for the people. I hope that you will not forget the language. Ireland will be lost if she does not preserve her language. Look at Bulgaria now. She is the admiration of the world. And why? Because she preserved her language. So whatever circumstances he was in, he was always stressing the importance of everything. One time when he was reviewing the troops of the Fianna Éireann, the National Boy Scout, right? He was congratulating them on all the work and all the drills and everything else. But he said, in addition to the training of their bodies, there was the training of their minds and the study of their native language and history. And also, you remember the humanitarian work he did for feeding the starving children of Carraroe in the islands in Connemara, okay? And that he ensured, got up a movement going, that there would be a meal provided free and gratis for all of the children during the lunch break, okay? But in response, he says, when he was writing about this, in response to your appeal, it is in striking testimony to the widespread national feeling evoked on behalf of the Irish language. For I think, were your lists of subscribers analysed, it would be found that the vast bulk was made up of those who contributed, not alone for love of the people they wish to help, but for the love of the old language. Those people have so faithfully and so fluently retained. All right? And also he has stipulated that they had to speak Irish while they were, this is more or less a reversal of the old superism, right? They had, if they were going to be fed, they had to speak Irish as a result. What Mrs. Green said of the Irish Literacy Society in London, she praised Sir Roger Casement's plan for providing meals for the school children in the middle of the day, on condition that the conversation was in Irish. It was a melancholy thing to find in so many quarters a contempt for the Irish language and the almost absolute indifference in learned circles in England to the oldest and finest language and literature of the world. Right? I'm going to close now in a second. You'll be glad to hear. So he continued, even in the last time when he was incarcerated before his death, he made practical use of the Irish language, because no matter who the visitors were, the warden had to be present. Right? And also, so he said in this, upon the last visit of his nearest relatives, he hit upon a plan, nothing less than to hold their conversation in Gaelic. This was done, the warder, an Englishman, not understanding one word of the glorious language, so that Roger Casement's last words and messages were given in the language he so dearly, dearly loved. It is hoped, and again, remember that Casement was not a unique person. There were so many people involved, and all of their minds were coming together, and it resulted in coming from different directions in what culminated in 1916. You have even people like Yeats, etc., saying, in New York in 1904, I hope we will all live to see the day when Irish will again be spoken in Ireland, to the exclusion of all other tongues. The Gaelic language will be a barrier to the vulgarity and coarseness, which is today the plague of Ireland. And I'll end with another quote from Roger Casement. There are a good many things I'd cheerily go to jail for, and one is the poor, old, downtrodden, despised Irish language. Michael.
Michael.